So I'm the living proof that it can be loosely related to UX, given that I'm neither a UX designer nor actually going to teach you anything new about UX. At least I hope not, because so that's the most self-conceited slides that I'll have in my slide deck. I like to see that kind of slides when I go to a talk, because I think it's always fun to see, like, okay, what did the people do before they give the talk, and what kind of stuff do they like? I have a background in academia, so I'm a computer scientist by trade, I guess. I'll come back to that later. It's part of the actual story. That's not part of the story here. I briefly ran a mobile, eco-friendly car wash, very briefly. And then now I'm at the head of a SaaS startup. Head off is a big name, a team of 3 people. And that's sort of the part of the story. So I'm going to talk about building and marketing Figma plugins, which is not very UX related. Still think it might be interesting for mainly 2 reasons. One is I had a couple of you come up to me and ask me, like, okay, I have this idea for a plugin. How do I go about building it, marketing it? What's the process like? That kind of stuff. So I'll essentially just share our story, what we did right, what we did wrong. I hope you get something out of it if you want to build a Figma plugin. And then I think in general, whether you like it or not, Figma is taking up a big sort of spot and place in the design world. It's going from a simple, in between quotes, design tool to more of a general infrastructure, in the same way that the cloud now is infrastructure for everything related to development. I think Figma is slowly moving into being the go-to design infrastructure. And so essentially building plugins is going to be something that is increasingly important. So that's about me. There's one other person that I need to talk to you about, which is part of the storyline, and we'll gradually go into the building of the Figma plugins. That's Jesse, it's my co-founder. We were both at the VUB when we studied computer science, and Jesse did a thesis on helping citizen scientists to build their own data collection applications. So citizen scientists, you have a group of people that are concerned about something in their environment. Could range from counting birds to measuring air pollution. And typically they do this on pen and paper because they don't have the money to pay Panda Panda to develop them a nice app for a specific campaign. And so Jesse's entire thesis was, can we build a no-code platform specifically made for these people to help them build no-code apps? And so at some point I walked into his office because I'm a crap developer and he's a great one. So I was like, hey, if you want to do something with your technology, I'll help you try to get something out there on the market, which is not the way you want to go about building a product or a business. Essentially just reverse engineering a problem, right? So given that piece of technology, citizen science wasn't really a market. It's more of a sort of a side project or a not-for-profit kind of thing. And so I spent a good year on a side project talking to a whole bunch of people in different sectors, ranging from transportation to events. That was right before COVID, so that was very bad timing. Ranging to like Industry 4.0, trying to figure out who could use a no-code app builder for data collection. And I then got into touch with Tine Peters from Studio Dot, which I guess is sort of half around the corner. At least for me, I'm from Brussels, so everything in Antwerp is around the corner. It's a slight jab at Antwerp. So before her, for me, design was essentially just gradients and roundings, and I know that's sort of a heresy, but I think that's a huge problem with the computer science curriculum today. Like, you're not taught about design at all. Not even like the fundamentals or what it's used for. For you, design is just like, oh, it's UI stuff. I think that's a major issue with our computer science curriculum, but that's another problem. So I met Tina at a conversation starter event, and she saw what we were doing, and she's like, yeah, actually that's great. There's a whole bunch of other tools as well, but I see the potential in yours. But the main peeve I always have with no-code tools is that none of them integrate with Figma. And all of our designers work in Figma. I don't want to have to redo our design into some crappy, handicapped version of Figma in a no-code tool. And she said, if you can integrate your tool with Figma, I think you have something truly unique, and you have something that we would use to build prototypes, because that's a lot of what we do in testing, etc., is building prototypes, but we're unable to reach the level of functionality or fidelity that we want within Figma. So she introduced me to like a whole bunch of things like Nielsen Norman, UX Antwerp. So I started attending events to figure out what do UX designers and UI designers actually do. And that led me into like product discovery. So I put my gamer face on. That's a Brussels product management joke. Nobody's laughing, so I guess nobody knows Timothée. So the goal was like, okay, I'm going to scope out agencies in Belgium, and I'm going to try to just talk with their designers to figure out in prototyping land, like what are the major pet peeves that people have today. So I talked to some people like Sebastian at Panda Panda, In the Pocket, Springbok. That's pretty cool about designers. They're open to talk about stuff if you just reach out. And so I have a couple of stuff come back, like Figma, it's a lot of prototyping spaghetti. Feels like a step back when you compare to Axure on functionality perspective. There weren't working inputs. I have trouble with like data input and output. So there were obvious pain points, and there was an obvious problem to solve. And so we set out to essentially solve it. So we built the first plugin, which is called Weavly. The goal was you have your design in Figma. You have some prototyping, some blue spaghetti in there. You use our plugin to tag stuff in your design. And then you have this drag and drop no-code editor, which turns your design into a full stack web application. Back-end, front-end, with working data inputs, working calculations, maps, locations, you name it. So the goal was to turn your Figma design into a very high fidelity prototype in the blink of an eye, and to enable you to use that for user testing, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, because we track some metrics, the way that Maze does as well in the clickable versions. So that was the first plugin that we built. The things that went right, and a lot of stuff went wrong, so this is not a humble brag because it looks good, but it's actually not. So we reached about 6,500 users, 600 of those are monthly active across the globe. So that's the nice thing about Figma. You write sort of an ecosystem which is inherently global. So once you're in there, you scale globally as well. And of course, the question is like, okay, how do you reach those users? You could consider 6,500 a lot or not a lot, doesn't really matter. I mean, you still need to reach them somehow. So we first tried our hand at cold outreach, so sending emails to people, connecting on LinkedIn, talking to people. We also tried some more funky stuff. So at that point, we had an intern, Jesper, join the team. We also made him take stupid pictures with props in a warehouse in Aalst. That's the very bad thing to do, by the way, if you have a new intern. Don't take him to an abandoned warehouse with like a toy gun to have pictures taken, because he was kind of not on a... Yeah, he was skeptical about what kind of pictures we would take. And so we had him rebuild prototypes of digital agencies that they had in their portfolio. So he would scout portfolio of agencies or freelancers, have a look at what they've built, rebuild it in Figma, but add extra functionality, and then we would send a cold outreach email also to Sebastian. I think you were recipient of that cold outreach campaign as well, saying like, hey, we redid your prototype, but we added a lot of functionality to it. That heavily backfired because essentially Jesper wasn't a designer, he was like a marketing student, so it didn't look bad, but like from a pure design perspective, it could probably look better. So we tried a whole bunch of stuff called outreach-wise, and I think designers in general are pretty sort of reticent to salesy people or salesy talks in general. Maybe that's other people as well, but I have a feeling that designers are sort of sales. So outreach doesn't scale and doesn't work to get users onto your Figma plugin if you decide to build one. What did work was our YouTube channel. So essentially, the tactic that we approached was, let's try to make short videos about how to do something in prototyping, from a prototyping perspective within Figma, right? So we sort of like, how do you dynamically show and hide elements based on an interaction, for example? I think that's something that you can do today with variables. Back then you couldn't. And so you sort of play on the border of, yeah, are you doing this in Figma or with your plugin, right? So that's kind of the way you get people to watch the video and then use your plugin. And that worked. So that's the reason why we got the users that we got. It's because, yeah, people essentially are looking for a way to add camera functionality to their Figma prototypes. And there's not a lot of, I think there's no plugins that do it. So essentially you're almost always top of the results. And you can see that by the number of views. Again, depending on how much of a YouTuber you are, those are like rookie numbers or they're big numbers. They did the job for us. By the end, when we killed all of our nice content, I'll come to that later, I think per month we get like 7,000 views. So that's 7,000 people, designers, that are watching your videos. In itself, that's pretty cool, and that drives the traffic to your channel. So that was one of the key learnings is putting out content, much more scalable than doing outreach. Okay, so that's all that went well. What went wrong? So essentially we found a problem that was worth solving, where we never actually validated, or I mean, that was validation or invalidation of the solution that we put on the market. So most of the feedback that we would get was, yeah, it's cool and all, but I don't want my Figma prototype to run in the browser. I want my Figma prototype to run inside the Figma prototype environment. And all of the stuff that you add on top of it, it doesn't run in the Figma prototype environment. That's a technical limitation. Figma doesn't allow us to actually change your prototype. So we take your design and we create a web app from that. Most people were unhappy with that. They wanted all of that functionality that we add in the web, but running inside of their Figma prototype. So there was nothing that we can do about that. Still, technically, that's still a limitation that you have. So that was one lesson that we learned painstakingly. Is like, it's not because you've identified a problem that you've identified the right solution for it. And the other problem was, yeah, we said we solved prototyping spaghetti, but we just introduced another layer of spaghetti to it. The tool was immensely complex. And essentially, there's no going around that, because when you build a web app, you need to think about your database schema. Even if you don't call it a database, it's still a schema. You need to think about if you do conditional flows and logic and calculations. All of that is essentially programming. And even if you're only dragging boxes and arrows, you're still programming. Which means that you, one, need to understand most of these concepts. Some UX designers do, some don't. And you end up with this, which is probably worse than your Figma prototype spaghetti, because now you have spaghetti at 2 different platforms. So that was also a problem. So essentially, it wasn't exactly the right thing. People weren't looking exactly for this solution, and the solution we had was way too complex. So that's one thing. I think in general, startups do this too much, and we did that as well. So I said like, oh, all those users and the monthly active users, and it sounds like it's a nice story. But of course, these are all vanity metrics. They don't actually really matter, right? So when we look at the metrics that do matter, how many users are actually building prototypes on the platform and not just some activity, we go from 600 to 50 per month. So that's a big step down. And then we look at the revenue that we were generating. The average month was 75 euros. So 75 without the, just 75. So that's, I don't know, like 3 times your hamburger, or like maybe 2 times the hamburger order of today. So that's a problem if you want to like build a business out of that. That doesn't work. And then came sort of the, so we were noticing like, okay, there's something wrong. We need to sort of change the way that we're doing this. We were going to redesign the entire platform from a UX perspective to try to make it easier. And then Config 2023 happened. So I was sitting at the Figma, Friends of Figma in Brussels for a watch party. And then Dylan was on stage, and essentially slide after slide was either exactly our value proposition in the sense of variables, or it's our larger vision that we had was generating code that your developers could then use from your prototype, which also fits exactly into this larger vision that Figma presented on stage. That might sound obvious now, and obviously we were aware that we were too close to Figma's core value proposition, but we figured like, we still have time. Like every time on Config they introduce some new features, but it's always gradual, it's incremental. And then they just like slapped us. I felt physically ill at the end of that conference because some people were starting to look back at me because some people knew what we were doing. And they were like, are you seeing this? It's like, yes, I'm sitting here. I know this sucks. You don't need to tell me. I see it also. So we needed to do something, right? So the plugin was basically dead in the water. One thing that we were noticing before all of this happened was sort of a strange use case on our prototyping platform. And that's one of them. A lot of our users, and actually a lot of the paying users, were using our prototyping tool to build forms and surveys, which initially when we saw the first cases of people doing that, we thought like, okay, this is just completely insane. Why would you build a form? Why would you design a form or a survey in Figma? It doesn't make any sense. Why would you then use a prototyping tool to turn it into a working thing, send it out to people, and collect the responses? That sounded like something super, super niche. Until at some point, it became like most of our paying users were doing this. We needed to move. We needed to do something. And so we initially doubled down on that exact use case, building forms and surveys in Figma. And so the first question I have, so that's the Timothée part again, is why on earth would people want to do this in the first place? Like, what's wrong with the type forms and the tallies of this world that people want to put themselves through using a badly designed prototyping tool in Figma to build a web form? So I basically started from scratch again. So over the summer, blank slates, product discovery, let's try to find as many designers as I can and talk to them about building forms. Finding a new batch, because of course all of the old batch of designers, one, I harassed them too much. So at some point you can't ask people to do product discovery like 5 times. And they already knew what we were doing. So I wanted to make sure that we start with like a completely blank slate with people that didn't know us so that I can go in depth on form building as a designer. And essentially what came out of a good 20 conversations that I had was that what people are looking for, especially designers, is a way to control the UX and the UI of their web forms. Not always, but in some cases they need to. So for example, Sukala working with kids and trying to tell a story through her survey using Google Form, which is sort of the most boring options that's out there. And so that was sort of a pain point that we never noticed or talked about before. But it's the lack of fine-grained control of UX and UI in web forms. And so, okay, we decided to not scrap because our prototyping plugin is still live, but build a new plugin, which is this time a lot more easier. We just generate you a design kit. You tailor that design kit to your brands or your brands or your style or whatever you want to do. And out comes a web form that you design in Figma, but which is sort of completely tailored to the UX and the UI you way you want it. And of course, data comes in and you can then send it to HubSpot, Zapier, Notion, you name it. So that's the second plugin that we launched. And I think for us, that served as a lesson as well, that in the end, that use case, if you would have just talked to users and done user research, and I'm definitely not the best at doing user research, but I probably would never have gotten to a point where that would have come up in any discussion. It's like, oh, I would want to design my forms in Figma, my web forms and my service in Figma. I don't see a path in user research where we could have ended up on that. I think in some cases, the only thing you can do, like the best user research you can do, is put something in the field and see how people use it. You need to give them something to be able to sort of detect that emerging behavior. You can't do everything through product discovery and user research. And a case in point is that while we initially thought like, okay, the use case is like you want full control of the UX and UI of your form, as it turns out, there's quite a lot of people that just stick to the blank design and style that we generate because they like staying in Figma. So they wanted to do as much as they can in Figma. The fact that it looks blank, they don't care. It looks as blank as a Google form. But the fact that they can just do it within Figma for them is the major added value. And so we started adding, which to us are like even crazier features, the ability to generate charts and graphs inside of Figma with the data you collected. Like that was one of Claire's asks, like, oh, I also generate my charts from Excel, and then I pull them in as SVGs and I change them inside of Figma. Could you just do it from within the plugin, which to us was another level of niche and sanity. It's like, okay, we're building forms in Figma, now we're generating graphs in Figma. But turns out there's quite a lot of people that just want to do everything in Figma. And so, again, that's the kind of stuff, never would have noticed this unless we actually put out the product. So that's our story. I think there's like 4 essential key takeaways if you're looking to build plugins inside of Figma. The first one is, of course, like, is it like who builds Figma plugins in general? There's about everything, right? So going from freelancers to obviously product companies. I see a lot more agencies building plugins. So Panda and Disco Deli. I see, like, there's a whole bunch of agencies that add like tiny products in Figma through the means of plugins to generate some kind of recurring revenue next to the fact that they have projects, of course. You have different categories, of course, of plugins. Depending on the category, I think the pricing strategy is different. So you have design assisting. So for example, the angle plugin, which allows you to skew and angle frames and designs in a nice way. I would call that an assisting plugin because you completely stay inside of the Figma ecosystem. To enhancing, Emailify allows you to design an email in Figma and then send it, or export the HTML so you can send it via your email client, which is pretty cool and is mostly actually happening outside of the Figma system itself. And then you have the others category. If you want to joke around, Figsplosion, you essentially run it in your design and it explodes your design. So it just, all the components go everywhere, all of your frames go everywhere, for the sake of like lighting it on fire. And then the best part is the feature request in the comment section. People start bitching about, oh, it's too slow, because of course, yeah, if you run a huge design and you try to explode it, it tries to animate it, so it like moves the frames around. And then, oh, it would be nice if you add burning animations to it. So people are, I mean, I don't understand how dedicated you could be to a plugin that just explodes your design, but you also find these kinds of things. I don't know if they have a paying tier, but I wouldn't be surprised. And so pricing-wise, they of course range from completely free to the like $1 and $15 trench, which is typically more for the assisting kind, because your value is tied to the one that Figma has. So if you only provide value inside of Figma, it's hard to justify a price that goes above your average or your lowest Figma seat. If you provide value outside of Figma, the way that Emailify does, or some of those design to codes plugin do, then the price can be significantly higher and people are still willing to pay for it. So like 1645 range is definitely fine. And you can go up to all the way to 150 per seat for a tool like Anima, for example. So that's the occasionally more type. So you thought you would make it through a presentation without me talking about AI. Gotcha. So you might think, okay, I have an idea for a plugin, but I don't have a lot or I have no developer skills. And as it turns out, ChatGPT, the 3.5 version, but definitely the 4.0 version, has quite a good knowledge of the Figma plugin API, to the point where, as a development novice, you can get a pretty good, decent first draft of your Figma plugin running purely by interacting with GPT. So that's definitely worth checking out if you want to build a plugin but you have no idea how to get started. Of course, there's tutorials about it, but definitely open up GPT or ChatGPT and ask it to build your plugin for you, essentially. And of course, there's a whole bunch of design influencers that did this before. And then finally, so regarding the process itself, again, this is very documented, so I'm just going to like go through it. So it's a single review thing, so you build your plugin if you want to have it accepted into the community as an official plugin. There's no unofficial plugins, there's only official plugins. You need to send it to the Figma team, give them an account and whatnot, and they'll do a single review of it. So they'll make sure that there's no obvious bugs. I don't think they look at the actual code, so if you want to mine Bitcoin on people's Figma ecosystem, potentially that could be done. And afterwards, you can just publish updates. So it's not like in the App Store where you need to like resubmit and there might be a re-review. Once you're in, you can just submit updates and it's live. It goes live immediately. Do you get a lot of support from Figma? Do you need to be in touch with Figma? Not at all. So you're in touch with their developers or the people responsible for the API for help desk support, essentially. But for the rest, there's no affiliation with Figma. You're not in touch with Figma. They don't promote you in any way. They sometimes promote plugins, but it's just because they like them. We use Stripe as a payment mechanism behind our plugin, but Figma launched their payment systems in beta. So they take a 15% cut if you sell through the Figma community and you use their payment system. It's half of what the 30% of Apple, exactly. And they still allow you to sell through other means as well. But I have a feeling that that's not going to last. So they're going to monetize the community, that's for sure. So I'm assuming that they're going to enforce everybody that sells in the community to use their payment system. If you want to do something now, I would suggest against it because you're very limited in what you can do. Like you can't have multiple tiers, you can't have like monthly versus yearly pricing. So it's very, very limited. And once you go for the Figma payment system, the fine print stipulates that you can't go back. So you can't say like, oh, in the end we'll go for Stripe or whatever. That doesn't work. And of course you have lots of competition. I mean, typically. So for example, yeah, for most things that you see as a designer that you do every day, you probably already tried a plugin. Most things like tiny, low-hanging fruits are already developed. Of course, you can still find niches like Emailify, like the ones that we are, where there's nobody or almost nobody if you want to build a plugin, of course. So that's essentially our story of building plugins and marketing them. I I hope you learned something out of it, even if it's my stumbling with UX and product discovery. If you have any questions, feel free to shout them out now or have a beer with me afterwards, or send me an email, of course. If you want to try it out, you can try it out for free, the plugin, of course, and don't hesitate with feedback. I won't harass you for product discovery too much, unless you explicitly say, yeah, I'm up for a product discovery call. Thanks.
Thank you so much for what is a very transparent talk, one of the more transparent I've seen. I do want to quickly add that on average, I think there's like 3 to 4 times on a given project where I do want to blow up my Figma. I want 3 or 4 times on a runtime project, definitely. Any questions from the audience? Not all at the same time? Yeah, wait, we're going to do this the live stream way.
How hard was it to give up on your original idea of what this plugin was supposed to be?
That's a very good question, actually. So I think we were forced to. So I think it would have been a lot harder if Figma didn't so obviously move into the direction that we were heading in all of the sudden. Well, not all of the sudden, but that made it easy. In the sense that the night itself was horrible, the day afterwards as well, because we essentially just sat down and said, okay, either we stop now, or we need to do something, and we have no idea what that something might be. But that forced us to do it. So at that evening, I knew, like, okay, it's done. The prototyping part, that's just over. I think it would have been very hard, because you're always able to improve, right? So you have some paying traction, so you think, maybe if we do this, and maybe if we do that. This was like a clean-cut moment, which actually just gave us the needed kick in the butt to stop it. It actually it's still live. It's still generating 75 euros in revenue monthly. But I've killed all of the YouTube content around it because it was starting to generate traffic for the new plugin. But then people were confused because they wanted to do prototyping. They ended up on the Forms plugin, so that was even worse situation. So I just disabled everything. So now the visibility is essentially 0 unless you're Googling inside or searching inside of the Figma community. So.
Anyone else? Any other questions? No? Okay, well, Florian is here. If you do want to test it out or you have further questions, he'll be hanging around for a bit longer, I guess.
Yep.
Yes, having another beer. We will be taking a break. The next talk will start at 8, so we have a good 20-25 minutes of networking. If you are looking for the toilet, it is the wooden block outside. That's how it was explained to me. So that's where the toilet's at. Grab a drink, have a beer, and try to talk to someone you don't know yet. See you in a bit.